She was 7 months pregnant, exhausted and invisible, until Elena Alvarez slid a cup of black coffee across the table and the most dangerous man in the city discovered the note tucked beneath the saucer. "They're coming for you tonight." And when the Mafia Boss looked up, he did not see a waitress anymore. He saw a witness, a liability, and the only person in 3 years brave enough or foolish enough to try saving his life. Harbour Street Cafe sat on the corner of two forgettable roads in a neighbourhood that asked no questions. The kind of place where the coffee was strong, the lighting was dim, and the regulars kept their eyes on their own plates. Evening had settled over the city like a held breath, and inside the cafe, the dinner rush had thinned to a handful of scattered tables. A couple argued in whispers near the window. A man in a wrinkled suit stared at his phone without scrolling. 2 women shared a slice of pie and said nothing at all. Elena had been 6 hours into her shift when the man in the tailored charcoal coat walked through the door and claimed the corner table without hesitation. He did not look at the menu. He did not smile at the hostess. He simply sat with his back to the wall and his eyes on every exit, and the entire room shifted around him like water parting for stone. She noticed it immediately. The way conversations lowered, the way the couple by the window asked for their check before finishing their meals, the way the manager, a man who never left the register, personally crossed the floor to refill the stranger's water glass, nodding once before retreating without a word. Before we go any further, drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Go ahead. I will wait. Elena had learned to read rooms the way other people read books. Pregnancy had sharpened her senses into something almost painful, a constant alertness that never fully rested. She noticed the weight of his watch, the way his coat hung slightly uneven on the left side, the stillness in his hands, which never fidgeted, never tapped, never betrayed a single unnecessary thought. He was not nervous. He was not waiting. He was assessing the same way a predator assessed terrain before deciding whether to hunt or retreat. She poured his coffee without being asked. Black. No sugar, no cream. He had not spoken a word, but she knew. Men like him did not explain themselves. They expected the world to adjust. What she did next, she could not fully explain, even to herself. 3 weeks of watching, 3 weeks of noticing the 2 men who sat at separate tables every Thursday night. Their eyes never on their food, always on the corner booth. 3 weeks of overhearing fragments in the alley, of reading a name in the news, of connecting pieces she wished she had never seen. 3 weeks of telling herself it was not her problem, not her business, not her war. But when she set the coffee down that night, her hand moved before her mind could stop it. She slid the folded receipt beneath the saucer with the kind of precision that came from years of placing plates without spilling, and she stepped back before he could look up. Too late. His fingers found the paper the moment hers left the table. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. 6 words in her handwriting stared back at him. "They're coming for you tonight." The air between them compressed into something solid. Victor Russo lifted his gaze, and Elena felt the full weight of it land on her like a hand pressing against her chest. His eyes were dark, unreadable, the colour of winter rivers beneath overcast skies. He did not blink. He did not react. He simply looked at her face, at her swollen belly, at the tremor she could not hide in her fingers, and in that silence, she understood that she had just rewritten the terms of her own survival. She turned and walked back toward the counter. Her heart slammed against her ribs with every step. The distance felt infinite. Each tile beneath her shoes a small eternity. She could feel him watching her, not with anger, not with gratitude, with something far more dangerous. Calculation. Behind her she heard nothing. No chair scraping, no footsteps, no sudden commotion. When she finally allowed herself to glance back, Victor Russo had not moved. He sat exactly as before, the coffee cup raised to his lips, the receipt folded neatly and tucked into his coat pocket. He drank slowly, savouring it, as if the evening had not just fractured into before and after. The 2 men across the room exchanged glances. One of them checked his phone. The other adjusted his jacket, and Elena saw the outline of metal beneath the fabric. She gripped the edge of the counter to keep her hands from shaking. She had done it. She had warned him. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now she stood on the other side with no map, no protection, and no idea what came next. Victor set down his cup. He looked at her one more time across the length of the cafe, and something shifted in his expression. Not softness, not warmth, but acknowledgement, a tiny fracture in the mask. He checked his watch. He signalled for the bill. And Elena realized, with a clarity that turned her blood to ice, that the most dangerous man in the city was now making decisions, and every single one of them involved her. Victor's eyes followed Elena across the room, not with gratitude, but with the cold calculation of a man deciding whether she had just saved his life or ended hers. 3 weeks before the note changed everything, Elena Alvarez was mopping the floor of Harbour Street Cafe at 11:47 in the evening, alone, exhausted, and counting the minutes until she could take off her shoes. The last customer had left an hour ago. The manager had handed her the keys with a tired wave and disappeared into the night, trusting her to lock up the way she had done dozens of times before. The cafe felt different when it was empty, smaller, quieter. The hum of the refrigerator became the loudest sound in the room, and the streetlights outside cast long patterns across the tile that shifted whenever a car passed. She finished the floor, wrung out the mop, and grabbed the 2 trash bags from behind the counter. The back door opened into a narrow alley that smelled of rain and old grease, and she had made this walk so many times that her body moved on autopilot. Push the door, prop it open with her hip, drag the bags to the dumpster, toss them in, return inside, lock up, go home. But that night, she heard voices. They came from the far end of the alley, near the service entrance of the building next door. 2 men, their shapes barely visible in the weak glow of a single bulb mounted above a rusted door. They were arguing, not shouting, something worse. The kind of low, controlled fury that came from people who knew how to hurt each other without raising their voices. Elena froze with her hand still on the dumpster lid. She should have turned around. She should have walked back inside, locked the door and pretended she had heard nothing. But her feet would not move, and the fragments of conversation drifted toward her like smoke she could not escape. Thursday. Every Thursday. Same table, same time. He thinks no one notices. We noticed 3 months ago. The problem is getting close enough. Russo has eyes everywhere. You move too soon, and we are the ones in the ground. The name landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Russo. She did not know it. She had no reason to remember it. But something in the way they spoke, reverent and hateful at once, made her file it away in a part of her mind she did not fully control. The window is Thursday. If he shows, we move. If he does not, we wait another week. And if he brings his people? He never brings his people to that cafe. That is the whole point. He thinks it is beneath notice. Silence. One of them lit a cigarette, and the orange glow briefly illuminated a jaw, a scar, a pair of eyes that swept the alley without settling on her shadow pressed against the dumpster. Elena did not breathe. She did not blink. She stood perfectly still until her lungs burned and her legs trembled beneath the weight of her belly, and when the 2 men finally turned and walked away, she counted to 60 before she allowed herself to move. She went inside. She locked the door. She drove home in a fog of disbelief, telling herself that she had misheard, misunderstood, that it was nothing, that it had nothing to do with her. 4 days later, she saw the name again. It appeared on the television screen in her sister's living room, beneath a headline that made her stomach drop. Businessman survives attempted hit. The anchor spoke in the detached tone reserved for violence that happened to strangers, and the photograph beside her showed a man in his early 40s with dark hair, sharp features, and eyes that revealed nothing. Victor Russo, real estate developer, philanthropist, survivor. Elena stared at the screen until her sister asked if she was feeling okay, and she lied and said yes, and she spent the rest of the night unable to sleep. The men from the alley returned the following Thursday. She recognized them the moment they walked through the door, separately, 10 minutes apart, as if they did not know each other. The first one took a booth near the window. The second one sat at the counter with a newspaper he never read. They ordered coffee, picked at food they did not eat, and watched. The street, the door, the corner table that remained empty all night. Elena served them with steady hands and a blank expression, and she told herself it meant nothing. They were customers. The cafe was public. She had no proof of anything except a conversation she should never have heard. But she could not unknow what she knew. She was not brave. She had never been brave. She was a pregnant woman, working double shifts to pay rent on an apartment she could barely afford, abandoned by a man who had promised her forever and delivered nothing. She did not have the luxury of courage. She did not have the safety net that allowed other people to take risks and survive the fall. And yet, every Thursday for 3 weeks, the 2 men returned. Every Thursday they watched the corner table. Every Thursday Elena felt the weight of knowledge pressing against her ribs, demanding something she was not sure she could give. She told herself she would stay invisible. She told herself it was not her fight. She told herself that whatever happened to Victor Russo was the consequence of a life she could not imagine and a world she did not belong to. She almost believed it. The Thursday after the news report, the man from the headline walked into Harbour Street Cafe, sat at the corner table and ordered black coffee. No sugar, no cream, no conversation. The father of Elena's child was named Daniel, and he had promised her the world in a voice so steady she mistook it for truth. They met at a friend's birthday party 2 years ago. He laughed easily, listened carefully, and looked at her like she was the only person in the room. 6 months later, they moved into a small apartment on the east side of the city, and she let herself believe that maybe life was finally giving her something instead of taking it away. The pregnancy was unplanned but not unwelcome, she told him on a Sunday morning, her hands shaking around the test, and he smiled and pulled her close and whispered that everything would be fine. She believed him. She wanted to believe him so badly that she ignored the way his smile did not reach his eyes, the way he started working late more often, the way his phone buzzed with messages he never answered in front of her. He left on a Tuesday 3 weeks after she entered her second trimester. No note, no explanation, just an empty closet and a text message that said he was sorry but he could not do this. She called him 17 times before his number stopped working, and she sat on the kitchen floor until the sun went down, one hand pressed against her stomach, wondering how she had become someone so easy to abandon. Her doctor warned her at the 5-month mark. The stress was affecting her blood pressure. The long hours on her feet were causing swelling that concerned him. He told her to cut back, to rest, to prioritize herself and the baby over everything else. He spoke with the calm authority of a man who had never worried about rent. Her sister echoed the same concerns with less diplomacy. Stop working nights. Move in with me. Let someone help you for once in your life. But her sister had 2 children of her own and a husband who worked construction jobs that came and went with the seasons. There was no room in that house for another body, another mouth, another set of needs competing for resources that were already stretched too thin. So Elena kept working. She took double shifts when they were offered, and single shifts when they were not. She smiled through the exhaustion that settled into her bones like concrete. She hid her swollen ankles beneath the counter and pretended not to notice when customers looked at her belly with something between pity and judgment. She drank water when she wanted to cry and coffee when she wanted to collapse, and she told herself that she only had to survive a few more months before the baby came and she could figure out what happened next. Harbour Street Cafe was her lifeline. The tips were decent. The manager never asked questions. The regulars tipped extra when they noticed her condition, and she pocketed the sympathy without shame because shame was a luxury she could no longer afford. The cafe was predictable, safe, beneath notice, until it became a trap. Every Thursday for 3 weeks, the same 2 men appeared. They never sat together, they never acknowledged each other. But Elena watched them the way she watched everything now, with the sharpened awareness of a woman who had learned that danger rarely announced itself. They ordered food they did not finish. They nursed coffee until it went cold. And their eyes never stopped moving, scanning the door, the street, the corner table where Victor Russo sat alone with his silence and his secrets. She told herself it was not her problem. She told herself that whatever war these men were fighting had nothing to do with her, that she was invisible, that staying invisible was the only strategy that had ever kept her alive. She had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned early not to see things, not to hear things, not to involve yourself in conflicts that belonged to other people. Mind your business. Keep your head down. Survive. But every Thursday, the weight grew heavier. She watched Victor Russo drink his coffee with the calm of a man who feared nothing, and she wondered if he knew. She watched the 2 men pretend not to watch him, and she wondered what would happen when they stopped pretending. She carried the fragments of their alley conversation like shards of glass in her pocket, cutting her every time she moved. She was about to bring a child into a world that had never once been gentle with her. A world that took fathers and left mothers with nothing but bills and broken promises. A world that rewarded silence and punished courage. She could not afford to be a hero. Heroes died in stories like this, or worse. They survived long enough to watch everyone they loved pay the price for their bravery. But she also could not afford to be a coward. Because if she stood by and did nothing, if she watched a man die because she was too afraid to act, what kind of mother would she become? What kind of lesson would she carry into that delivery room, into that first moment when her child looked up at her and needed her to be someone worth trusting? On the 4th Thursday, everything changed. Victor Russo arrived at his usual time, claimed his usual table, and ordered his usual coffee. The 2 men took their positions like actors hitting their marks. Elena moved through her shift with the mechanical precision of someone running on fumes and fear. At 8:37, the man by the window pulled out his phone and made a call. Elena was wiping down the counter near the front when she saw his lips move. She could not hear the words, but she did not need to. 3 weeks of watching had taught her to read the shape of danger in the smallest gestures. His mouth formed 2 words, clear as daylight through the glass. Tonight, he is here. Victor Russo had learned to kill before he learned to drive. He was 14 years old when his father placed a gun in his hands and told him that power was not given, it was taken, and the men who hesitated were the men who ended up in shallow graves. He pulled the trigger that night in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and the man on the other end of the barrel had begged for mercy that Victor did not have the authority to grant. His father watched without expression. When it was done, he placed a hand on Victor's shoulder and said, "Now you understand the cost of this life. Never forget it." He never did. 43 years old now, Victor operated an empire built on foundations the public would never see. Real estate developments that laundered money through shell corporations, import businesses that moved products no customs agent would ever inspect, silent partnerships in restaurants, nightclubs, and construction firms that paid tribute without asking questions. On paper, he was a businessman, a philanthropist, a survivor of an unfortunate incident that the police had failed to solve. In reality, he was the man other men feared to name. He had survived long enough to make his enemies desperate, and desperate men made mistakes. The attempt on his life 3 weeks ago had been sloppy. A car bomb that detonated 30 seconds too early, killing the driver who planted it instead of the target it was meant for. Victor had watched the news coverage from his penthouse apartment, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of knowing that someone had just revealed their hand. They would try again. They always tried again. Harbour Street Cafe was his Thursday ritual precisely because it was beneath notice. No reservations. No recognition. No one who mattered ever walked through those doors, which meant no one who mattered would think to look for him there. He sat at the corner table with his back to the wall, drank his coffee black, and allowed himself 1 hour each week to exist as something other than what he had become. He noticed the pregnant waitress the first night he returned after the bombing. She moved through the cafe with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for years, refilling cups before they emptied, clearing plates before customers finished asking, anticipating needs with a precision that most people mistook for instinct. But Victor recognized it for what it was: survival. The heightened awareness of someone who could not afford to miss details, because missing details meant losing tips, and losing tips meant losing ground in a fight she was already losing. He watched her over the following weeks without appearing to watch. The way she pressed her hand against her lower back when she thought no one was looking. The way her smile never quite reached her eyes. The way she hid her swollen ankles beneath the counter and kept working through exhaustion that would have broken someone with less to lose. She reminded him of his mother, and that was a dangerous thing to feel. His mother had worked 3 jobs to keep him fed after his father went to prison the first time. She never complained. She never stopped. She simply did what needed to be done until her body gave out and the cancer took what was left. Victor was 19 when she died, and he held her hand in the hospital room and promised her that he would never let anyone he loved suffer like that again. He had kept that promise by never allowing himself to love. If you think Victor is going to trust her, comment yes. If you think he is going to suspect a trap, comment no. Drop your prediction right now, because what happens next will surprise you either way. Victor did not trust unsolicited loyalty. He had learned that lesson the hard way, paid for it in blood that still stained his conscience on the nights when sleep refused to come. 8 years ago, a young man named Christopher had approached him at a fundraiser and whispered that there was a traitor in his organization. Victor listened. He investigated. He found nothing. And when Christopher turned up dead 3 days later, shot twice in the chest in an alley 6 blocks from his apartment, Victor realized too late that the warning had been genuine, and his own paranoia had silenced the only person brave enough to speak. He swore he would never make that mistake again, but trust was a currency he had stopped spending long before Christopher's body hit the ground. Everyone wanted something. Everyone had an angle. The world was full of people who smiled while they sharpened their knives. And Victor had survived this long by assuming the worst and preparing for worse. So when the pregnant waitress set down his coffee on the 4th Thursday, when her fingers brushed the edge of the table and he felt the paper beneath the saucer, his first instinct was not gratitude. It was suspicion. He unfolded the note slowly, letting his eyes scan the 6 words without betraying any reaction. "They're coming for you tonight." Neat handwriting. Steady hand. No hesitation in the letters, which meant she had written this with purpose, not panic. He looked up, and their eyes met across the table. She was already stepping back, already turning away, her body angled toward the counter like she wanted nothing more than to disappear. But she had not disappeared. She had chosen to be seen. She had chosen to involve herself in something that could destroy her, and Victor needed to understand why. His mind cycled through possibilities with the cold efficiency of a machine designed for exactly this purpose. She could be bait. A plant. Someone's desperate attempt to lure him into a trap by exploiting the one weakness he had never fully buried, his refusal to let innocence pay for his sins. Or she could be exactly what she appeared to be, a tired, pregnant woman who had seen something she should not have seen and made a choice that defied every survival instinct she possessed. Victor folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. He lifted his coffee and took a slow sip, buying time, buying clarity, buying the seconds he needed to decide whether the waitress had just saved his life or sealed her own death warrant. Who sent her? Elena stood behind the counter with her back to the corner table, and she could feel Victor Russo's gaze pressing against her spine like a hand she could not shake. She picked up the coffee pot. Her fingers trembled around the handle, and she watched the dark liquid ripple with each unsteady breath. A customer 3 seats down pushed his empty cup toward her, and she refilled it without meeting his eyes, without speaking, without allowing herself to turn around. The simple act of pouring coffee had never required so much concentration. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to look, to check, to see if he had moved, if he had left, if the note had changed anything at all. She did not look. The seconds stretched into something unbearable. She moved along the counter, topping off cups that did not need topping, wiping surfaces that were already clean, performing the motions of her job while her mind raced through every possible outcome. He could ignore the warning, he could report her to someone, he could assume she was part of whatever trap had been laid for him and respond accordingly. She had seen enough movies to know how men like him responded to threats. She had heard enough stories to understand that mercy was not a quality that kept people alive in his world. But she had made her choice. The note was in his pocket now, and there was nothing left to do but wait. Across the room, the 2 watchers exchanged glances. Elena caught the movement in her peripheral vision, a subtle shift, a tensing of shoulders, a communication that required no words. The man by the window checked his phone again. The man at the counter folded his newspaper and set it aside, his attention fixed on the corner table, with an intensity that made Elena's stomach clench. Something was wrong. She could see it in their posture, in the confusion that flickered across their faces before discipline smoothed it away. The target should have reacted. He should have left. He should have done something other than sit there drinking coffee like the world had not just whispered a death sentence in his ear. But Victor Russo did not move. He finished his coffee with the same unhurried calm he had shown every Thursday for the past month. He set the cup down gently, centered it on the saucer, and checked his watch as if he had somewhere to be, and all the time in the world to get there. Then he raised one hand, 2 fingers extended, and signaled for the bill. Elena's heart stopped. She pulled the check from her apron pocket, the one she had prepared 20 minutes ago when she still believed this night would end like every other night. Her legs carried her across the floor without her permission, each step heavier than the last, until she stood beside his table with the paper trembling in her grip. She placed it on the table. She did not run. She did not speak. For the first time in 4 weeks, Victor Russo looked directly at her and opened his mouth. How far along? His voice was lower than she expected. Quieter. It carried no threat, no accusation, no warmth. Just a question delivered with the same measured control that defined everything about him. Elena swallowed. 7 months. He nodded slowly, his eyes dropping to her belly for a fraction of a second before returning to her face. Something shifted in his expression, too brief to name, too real to ignore. He reached into his coat and withdrew a fold of bills, placing them on the table beside the check without counting. It was more money than she made in a week. "Leave through the kitchen," he said. "Now." 5 words. No explanation, no room for argument. Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to process the instruction. Leave. Through the kitchen. Now. The words made sense individually, but strung together they formed a command that belonged to a reality she had never inhabited. She was a waitress. She poured coffee. She did not receive orders from men who spoke like they expected the world to obey. But his eyes held no deception, no manipulation. They held something far more terrifying. Certainty. He knew what was coming. He had read her note, assessed the threat, and made calculations she could not follow. And somewhere in those calculations, he had decided that she mattered enough to warn. Elena's choice crystallized in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She could walk away. She could pretend this night had never happened, clock out, drive home, and pray that her invisibility would protect her the way it always had. She could convince herself that the money on the table was just a generous tip, that his words were just a strange goodbye, that none of this had anything to do with her. Or she could trust a stranger whose eyes held no warmth but whose words held no lie. She opened her mouth to respond. The cafe's front door swung open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust and something metallic that Elena could not name. Two men stepped through the entrance, their shoulders broad, their faces blank, their hands hidden inside dark jackets that hung too heavy to be empty. Behind her, the watchers stood from their tables in unison. The man by the window pushed back his chair with a scrape that silenced every conversation in the room. The man at the counter rose without haste, his newspaper abandoned, his eyes locked on the corner table. 4 men, 4 directions. And Elena stood in the center of it all, frozen between the counter and the only person who had ever told her to run. Victor Russo did not flinch. He did not reach for whatever weapon she knew he carried beneath that tailored coat. He simply looked at her one more time, and his voice cut through the tension like a blade. Kitchen, now. The first shot shattered the window beside the door before Elena could take a single step. Glass exploded inward, scattering across the floor in 1,000 glittering fragments. A woman screamed, high, sharp animal, and the sound broke whatever spell had held the room frozen. Chairs scraped, bodies moved. The couple by the window dove beneath their table. The man in the wrinkled suit threw himself toward the back of the cafe, his phone clattering from his hand. Elena did not remember dropping. One moment she was standing beside Victor's table, and the next her knees hit the tile behind the counter, her arms wrapped around her belly, her breath coming in ragged gasps that tasted like copper and fear. Above her head, another shot punched through the menu board mounted on the wall. Splinters of wood and laminate rained down on her shoulders. She pressed herself lower, her cheek against the cold floor, and through the gap beneath the counter she saw movement. Feet. Legs. The 2 men from the window and the counter advancing with weapons drawn, their steps measured despite the chaos around them. The 2 newcomers flanking the entrance, cutting off escape. 4 against 1. Except Victor Russo was no longer sitting at his table. He moved like something built for this exact moment. Fluid, precise, utterly without hesitation. His hand emerged from beneath his coat, holding a gun that seemed to materialize from nothing, and the first shot caught the man from the counter in the shoulder before he could aim. The impact spun him sideways, and his weapon discharged into the ceiling as he fell. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, opened them, forced herself to watch because looking away felt like dying. The man from the window fired twice. Victor was already moving, already somewhere else, his body low and fast as he closed the distance between them. The third shot went wide. There was no fourth. Victor's hand connected with the man's wrist, twisted, and the crack of bone was louder than the gunfire that preceded it. The 2 men at the door split up. One advanced towards Victor. The other swept his weapon across the room, searching for something, searching for someone. His eyes found Elena through the gap in the counter. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her belly scraping the floor, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The kitchen. She had to reach the kitchen. Victor had told her to go, and she had not listened, and now she was crawling across broken glass while a stranger with dead eyes walked towards her with a gun in his hand. A hand grabbed her arm from behind. She screamed, twisting, ready to fight, ready to claw and bite and do whatever it took to protect the life growing inside her. But the face above her belonged to the cafe manager, pale, terrified, his glasses cracked and hanging from one ear. "This way," he hissed, pulling her toward the kitchen door. "Come on, come on. Come on." They made it 3 steps before the door swung open from the other side. A third man stood in the frame, his silhouette backlit by the fluorescent glow of the kitchen. He was bigger than the others, broader, and the gun in his hand looked like an extension of his arm. His eyes swept from the manager to Elena, and his mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. The manager released her arm and stumbled backward. Elena froze, her hand pressed flat against her belly, her legs refusing to carry her any further. The man raised his weapon. Victor hit him from the side like a force of nature. The impact drove both men through the doorway and into the kitchen, their bodies colliding with a prep table that sent pots and pans crashing to the floor. Elena heard grunting, scuffling, the wet sound of fists connecting with flesh. She pressed herself against the wall, unable to move, unable to look away. Victor emerged 30 seconds later with blood on his knuckles and a calm expression that terrified her more than the violence that preceded it. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, and his hand landed on her shoulder, firm, steady, anchoring her to a reality that had fractured beyond recognition. "Stay behind me," he said. "Do not move until I tell you." She nodded. She could not speak. The back entrance burst open, and 2 more men stormed through with weapons raised. Elena flinched, but Victor did not. He simply watched as they swept the kitchen, checked the fallen attacker, and communicated in sharp gestures that required no translation. His men, they had known. In under 90 seconds, the cafe fell silent. The ringing in Eleanor's ears was the only sound left, a high, persistent whine that drowned out everything except her own heartbeat. She looked past Victor's shoulder at the destruction behind him. Broken glass, overturned tables, bodies on the floor, some moving, some not. The woman who had screamed was sobbing quietly in the corner, her husband's arms wrapped around her shaking frame. This was his world. Violence as language, death as punctuation. A grammar she had never learned and never wanted to understand. And yet, in the centre of that chaos, his hand had never left her shoulder. One of Victor's men approached, his face hard, his voice urgent. He leaned close and spoke words meant only for his boss, but Elena heard them anyway. They know her face. She is on the list now. Victor's grip on her shoulder tightened almost imperceptibly. He did not look at her. He did not explain. He simply stared at the man who had delivered the news, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a verdict already rendered. Then we take her with us. The alley behind Harbour Street Cafe smelled like rain and gunpowder, and Elena could not stop shaking. Victor's hand guided her through the back door, past the body she refused to look at, past the kitchen that would never feel safe again. His grip was firm but not cruel, steering her forward with the efficiency of a man who had done this before. She followed because following was easier than thinking, and thinking meant confronting everything she had just witnessed. A black SUV idled at the mouth of the alley, its engine humming low and steady. One of Victor's men stood beside the rear door, his face blank, his eyes scanning the rooftops with mechanical precision. He opened the door as they approached, and Victor guided Elena inside without breaking stride. The leather seat was cold against her legs. She slid across it, her hand pressed flat against her belly, her breath coming in shallow bursts that fogged the window beside her. Victor climbed in after her, and the door closed with a soft funk that sealed them inside a world she did not recognize. The SUV pulled forward. The cafe disappeared behind them. The sirens had not started yet, but Elena knew they would come. Someone would call. Someone would report the gunfire, the broken glass, the bodies left behind like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence she had never meant to write. She stared at her hands in the darkness. They would not stop trembling. Victor sat beside her, close enough to touch but miles away in every way that mattered. He did not reach for her. He did not offer words of comfort or reassurance. He simply existed in the space beside her, his presence heavy and still, his attention fixed on something beyond the tinted windows. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no softness. "You saved my life tonight." Eleanor flinched at the words. They landed in her chest like stones dropped into deep water, sinking past every defense she had built over 28 years of learning to protect herself. "That means they will take yours." She turned to look at him, and for the first time since the cafe, she found his eyes already waiting for hers. There was no gratitude in them, no warmth, only the cold acknowledgement of a debt incurred and a consequence set in motion.
"They saw your face," he continued. "They know you warned me."
"By morning, your name will be on a list that does not forgive and does not forget. The men who came for me tonight will come for you next, and they will not be as careless." Elena's throat tightened around words she could not form. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she was nobody, that no one would bother with a pregnant waitress who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But she had seen the look in the shooter's eyes when he found her behind the counter. She had heard the words his man had spoken in the kitchen. She is on the list now. "I just wanted to do the right thing," she whispered. The words came out broken, fragile, nothing like the steady handwriting she had left beneath his saucer. She had not asked for this. She had not wanted to be brave. She had simply seen something she could not unsee and made a choice she could not unmake. And now her entire life had been reduced to a seat in the back of a stranger's car, speeding toward a destination she had never asked to reach.
Victor's expression shifted.
It was subtle, a fractional softening around his eyes, a tension that loosened in his jaw before discipline pulled it tight again. He looked at her belly, at the swell of life she carried beneath her trembling hands, and something passed across his face that she could not name, regret perhaps, or recognition, the shadow of a memory he had buried long ago. "The right thing," he repeated, and the words sounded different in his mouth, heavier, older. "Most people never do the right thing, they look the other way. They tell themselves it is not their problem. They survive by staying invisible." He paused. "You chose differently." Eleanor did not know if that was a compliment or a condemnation. The SUV turned onto a highway, and the city lights began to thin outside the windows. Buildings gave way to warehouses. Warehouses gave way to open road. The darkness pressed closer, interrupted only by the sweep of headlights from passing cars that grew fewer with every mile. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked. Victor did not turn to look at her. His profile was sharp against the glow of the dashboard, carved from shadows and silence. Somewhere they cannot follow. The answer offered nothing and promised less. She was in a car with a man she had known for 4 weeks and understood not at all, driving toward a place she had never heard of, carrying a child she had not yet named into a future she could no longer predict. But she did not ask him to stop. She did not demand to be let out. Some part of her, the part that had written 6 words on a receipt and changed everything, understood that there was no going back. The door she had opened could not be closed, and the only path forward led through a darkness she had to trust him to navigate. Elena leaned her head against the cold window and watched the mile markers disappear into the night. What happens to me after tonight? The question left her lips before she could stop it, small and raw and utterly exposed. She felt Victor turn toward her in the darkness. She felt the weight of his attention settle on her face. She waited for an answer that would tell her everything she needed to know about the man beside her and the choice she had made. He did not speak. The silence stretched for miles, broken only by the hum of the engine and the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Eleanor closed her eyes and let it wash over her. Let it carry her toward whatever waited at the end of this road. If you were in Elena's position right now, would you trust him or would you run? Comment your answer. I need to know what you are thinking because this story is about to take a turn that none of us saw coming. The farmhouse appeared through the windshield like a ghost rising from the darkness. White clapboard siding, a wraparound porch, a red barn visible in the distance. It looked like something from a postcard, the kind of place where families gathered for Thanksgiving and children chased fireflies across open fields. Eleanor knew better than to trust appearances now. The SUV slowed at a gate that swung open without anyone touching it. Cameras mounted on stone pillars tracked their approach, and as they rolled up the gravel driveway, she counted 3 men stationed at intervals along the tree line. Their postures were casual, their eyes were not. Victor stepped out first and extended his hand to help her from the vehicle. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before accepting, and the warmth of his palm against her cold fingers sent a shock through her system that had nothing to do with temperature. Inside, the farmhouse abandoned its disguise. The walls were reinforced with steel plating visible behind carefully placed gaps in the drywall. Communication equipment filled a room off the main hallway. Monitors, radios, devices she could not identify. 2 more guards stood at the back entrance, their weapons holstered but accessible. The furniture was comfortable, tasteful even, but every window had been fitted with shutters that locked from the inside, and every door was heavier than wood alone could explain. Victor led her down a corridor to a room at the far end of the house. A bed,
A dresser. A private bathroom.
clean sheets and soft lighting, and a silence so complete it pressed against her ears. "Rest," he said. "You will be safe here." He turned to leave. "No!" The word came out sharper than she intended, and Victor stopped with his hand on the doorframe. He did not turn around. He waited. "I am not going to lie in that bed and stare at the ceiling while you decide what happens to me," Elena said. Her voice trembled, but she did not care. "I want answers. I deserve answers. You owe me that much." Slowly, Victor turned. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the faintest trace of respect. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." He studied her for a long moment, and she felt the weight of his assessment as clearly as she had felt it in the cafe. He was deciding something, measuring her against a standard she could not see. Then he stepped back into the room and closed the door behind him. They stood on opposite sides of the space, like fighters waiting for a bell. Elena lowered herself onto the edge of the bed because her legs would not hold her any longer. Victor remained standing, his back against the door, his arms crossed over his chest. "The men who came tonight work for a man named Gallo," he began. "We have been at war for 3 years. He wants what I have built, and he does not care how many bodies he has to step over to take it. What did you build? An empire." The word carried no pride, only fact. Real estate, import businesses, partnerships in industries that prefer silence to scrutiny. I started with nothing. A name no one respected, and a father who taught me that power was the only currency worth earning. He paused. "I earned it, and I have spent every day since protecting it from men like Gallo who believe they can take what they did not build." Elena absorbed this in silence. The words confirmed what she had suspected, what she had tried not to think about during those Thursday nights when she watched him drink his coffee with the calm of a man who feared nothing. "And the isolation?" she asked. "The empty tables? The cafe where no one knows your name?" Something shifted in his posture. A crack in the armor so small she almost missed it. Power comes with a price. The more you have, the fewer people you can trust. The men who call me boss would die for me, but they are soldiers, not friends. The women who share my bed leave before morning because I do not allow them to stay. He met her eyes. I chose Harbour Street because it was the only hour each week when I could pretend to be someone else, someone ordinary, someone who did not have to watch every shadow for the knife waiting in it. Elena understood isolation. She understood it better than he could possibly know. The father of my baby left when I was 4 months along, she said. The words came easier than she expected, pulled from her chest by the strange gravity of this room and this moment. He promised me everything and delivered nothing. My family offered prayers and sympathy, but not money, not help, not a spare room where I could rest without worrying about rent. She pressed her hand against her belly. I have spent the last 5 months terrified that I am going to fail this child before she even takes her first breath. That I am going to bring her into a world that will chew her up the same way it chewed me up, and I will not be able to protect her from any of it. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the car, heavier, more honest. Two people who trusted no one had found themselves in a room with nothing but the truth between them. No masks, no angles, just the raw admission of fears they had never spoken aloud. Victor crossed the room and lowered himself into the chair beside the window. The distance between them shrank, not in feet, but in something less measurable. You should not have warned me, he said quietly. Elena looked at him. I know. He held her gaze for a long moment, and the hardness in his eyes softened into something almost human. I am glad you did. Morning arrived without permission, spilling pale gold light through the shuttered windows of the safe house. Elena opened her eyes to unfamiliar surroundings. The clean white ceiling, the heavy dresser against the wall, the silence that pressed against her ears like cotton. For 3 disorienting seconds she did not know where she was. Then memory returned in fragments. The cafe, the gunfire, the back of the SUV, the conversation that had stripped her bare. She had slept. Somehow, impossibly, she had slept. Her body ached as she pushed herself upright, the familiar weight of her belly pulling her forward. The baby shifted inside her, a small movement that grounded her in the present. She was alive. They were both alive. Everything else could be figured out later. She found Victor in the main room, standing at the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. The morning light carved sharp lines across his face, illuminating the shadows beneath his eyes and the tension that lived permanently in his jaw. He had not slept. She could see it in his posture, in the way he held himself like a man who had spent the night listening for sounds that never came. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and something flickered across his expression before control smoothed it away. There is food in the kitchen, he said. Coffee, if you want it. I should not have too much caffeine. The words came out automatic, a reflex from months of doctor's appointments and pregnancy books. She crossed the room and lowered herself onto the couch across from his window. How long have you been standing there? Since 4. You need to sleep. I need to keep you alive. He said it without emphasis, without drama. A simple statement of fact. Sleep can wait. Eleanor studied him in the morning light. This man who had killed to protect her, who had brought her to a fortress disguised as a farmhouse, who had listened to her fears without judgment and shared his own without asking for anything in return. 24 hours ago he had been a stranger. Now he was the only thing standing between her and a threat she still could not fully comprehend. What happens now? She asked. Victor turned from the window and set his coffee on the table beside her. He remained standing, his hands at his sides, his posture formal in a way that suggested the conversation ahead required distance. I have a code, he said, a set of rules I have followed since I was old enough to understand what this life demands. One of those rules is simple. Debts must be repaid. He paused, letting the words settle. You saved my life last night. You put yourself in danger to warn a stranger knowing what it might cost you. That debt cannot go unanswered. Elena shook her head. I did not do it for repayment. I did it because I could not live with myself if I did not. I know. That is what makes the debt heavier. He moved to the chair across from her and sat down, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped loosely between them. For the first time since she had met him, he looked almost uncertain, almost human. I am offering you a choice, he said. Full protection until the threat is neutralized, however long that takes. My men will guard you. My resources will provide for you. You will want for nothing. He held her gaze, or, if you prefer, a new identity. Documents that cannot be traced. Money to start over somewhere far from here, somewhere gallows reach cannot follow. You can disappear, raise your child in peace, and never think about this night again. Elena's breath caught in her throat. It was everything she had ever wanted: safety, security. A future for her daughter that did not depend on double shifts and tips that varied with the weather. She had spent months lying awake at night, terrified of the uncertainty that waited beyond her due date. And now a man she barely knew was offering to erase that uncertainty entirely. But she had not earned it. She had written 6 words on a receipt, and somehow that had translated into a debt worth more than she could calculate. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why would you do this for a stranger, for someone you do not know, someone who means nothing to your world? Victor was silent for a long moment. The morning light shifted across his face, softening edges that had seemed so hard in the darkness of the cafe. "Because you saw me as a man worth saving," he said finally. His voice was quiet, almost reluctant, as if the words cost him something to speak aloud. Not a target, not a threat, not a monster in an expensive coat. You looked at me and decided that my life had value, even knowing what I am. He paused. No one has done that in a very long time. The words landed in Elena's chest and stayed there, warm and heavy and impossible to ignore. She thought of the isolation he had described the night before, the empty tables, the women who left before morning, the soldiers who would die for him but could never truly know him. She held something he could not buy, threaten, or control. Belief in his humanity, the simple, stubborn conviction that beneath the violence and the power and the blood on his hands, there was a man worth saving. The power between them shifted like sand beneath a wave. "And if I want to stay?" The question surprised her as much as it surprised him. She had not planned to say it. She had not even known she was thinking it until the words were already in the air, hanging between them like a bridge neither of them had expected to build. Victor turned from the window, and for the first time since she had met him, his expression was not calculated. It was not measured or controlled or hidden behind walls built over decades of survival. It was uncertain. "Stay?" he repeated, and the word sounded foreign in his mouth. Elena did not look away. "You heard me." 1 week changed everything and nothing at all. The immediate threat had been neutralized, a word Victor used with the same casual precision he used when ordering coffee. Gallo's men had retreated after the cafe incident, regrouping in the shadows where men like them always regrouped. 3 of them would never regroup again. The war was far from over, but the battle that mattered most had been won, and Elena Alvarez was still breathing. She stood at the farmhouse door on a Thursday morning, a bag packed at her feet, a black sedan waiting in the driveway to take her wherever she wanted to go. The sky was pale blue and streaked with clouds that moved slowly toward the horizon, and the air smelled like cut grass and possibility. 7 days she had spent, 7 days inside these walls, eating meals she did not cook, sleeping in a bed she did not own, watching Victor Russo command an empire from a farmhouse that looked like something out of a magazine. She had seen him take phone calls that made his jaw tighten. She had seen him give orders that men obeyed without question. She had seen him sit across from her at dinner and ask about her pregnancy, with a gentleness that contradicted everything she thought she knew about him. She had also seen him watch her when he thought she was not looking, and she had pretended not to notice, because noticing meant naming, and naming meant confronting something neither of them was ready to face. Victor appeared in the doorway behind her, and she felt his presence before she heard his footsteps. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and the faint trace of cologne that clung to his collar. He held an envelope in his hand. "This is everything you need," he said. "Enough money to start over anywhere you choose. New documents that cannot be traced. Contacts in 3 cities who will ensure you are never found by anyone looking." He extended the envelope toward her. "You can disappear, Elena. You can raise your daughter somewhere safe, somewhere my world will never touch." Elena looked at the envelope. It represented everything she had spent months praying for: security, freedom, a future unburdened by fear. 1 week ago she would have taken it without hesitation. 1 week ago she had been a different woman. She reached out and accepted it. Their fingers brushed in the transfer, and neither of them pulled away. The contact lasted only a moment, a heartbeat, a breath, but it carried the weight of every conversation they had shared in this house, every silence that had spoken louder than words. Elena felt the warmth of his skin against hers, and something shifted in her chest that she could not name. She looked up. His eyes were already waiting. The conversation that followed required no words. It lived in the space between them, in the questions neither dared to ask and the answers neither was prepared to give. What existed here had no name yet, no promise, no resolution. It was a door left open in a house full of locked rooms, and walking through it meant accepting a future neither of them could predict. Elena stepped back first. She bent to pick up her bag, and the movement broke whatever spell had held them frozen. "Thank you," she said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. "Bye and on." "For everything." Victor nodded once. His expression had returned to the controlled mask she remembered from the cafe, but something underneath it had changed. A crack in the armor that would not close completely. She walked toward the car. The driver opened the rear door and waited, his face professionally blank. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes, and each step carried her further from the farmhouse, and closer to a life she would have to rebuild from scratch. She was 3 feet from the car when she stopped. The decision came from somewhere deeper than thought. An instinct, a need, a refusal to let this moment end without saying what needed to be said. She turned, and Victor was still standing in the doorway, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "If I ever need you," she began. He interrupted before she could finish. "You will not need to ask." 5 words. No elaboration, no conditions, just a promise delivered with the certainty of a man who had never broken his word and never intended to start. Elena held his gaze for one more moment, burning it into her memory. The sharp lines of his face, the darkness of his eyes, the way he stood like a man who carried the weight of worlds and refused to bend beneath it. Then she turned, climbed into the car, and closed the door behind her. The sedan pulled away slowly, gravel popping beneath its tires. Elena pressed one hand against her belly, feeling her daughter shift inside her, and with the other hand she held the envelope she might never open. The farmhouse grew smaller in the rearview mirror, and Victor remained exactly where she had left him, standing in the doorway, watching, waiting. He did not wave, he did not move, but he did not look away. The car reached the gate, turned onto the main road, and the farmhouse disappeared behind a line of trees. Elena faced forward, her eyes on the horizon, her heart beating with something that felt dangerously close to hope. She did not know what came next. For the first time in her life, she did not need to. Victor watched until the sedan vanished from sight, and then he watched a little longer. The morning was quiet. The birds had resumed their songs. The guards at the perimeter had relaxed into their usual positions, and somewhere inside the house a phone was ringing that he did not care to answer. He turned to walk back inside. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. An unknown number. A single message. "She made the wrong choice. So did you. The war is not over. It has only just begun." Victor read the words twice. His expression did not change. His hand did not tremble. He simply slid the phone back into his pocket, looked once more at the empty driveway, and stepped inside. The door closed behind him, but it did not lock. That is where this story ends, for now. But I need to know what you think happens next. Does Elena come back? Does Victor go after her? Drop your theory in the comments, because the best stories are the ones we imagine together. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe. More are coming, and you will not want to miss them.